It's a pleasure for me to be here with two people I've known in different ways for a long time at this International Peace Institute IPI interview discussion. Let me introduce to you Omar Dajani, who is the co-chair of the board of A Land for All. More on what that is in a moment. Omar is the son of Palestinian refugees from Jaffa. He is today the professor of international law at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific, and worked for a number of years, I think for 2 years, as an advisor, a legal advisor for the Palestinian negotiating team, and then worked for the UN office, the UN Special Coordinator's office for Palestinian-Israeli affairs. My Pundak is the Israeli co-executive director of, again, A Land for All, of which more momentarily. Mai has worked in East Jerusalem in political struggles, has worked at the New Israel Fund, and goes as a feminist lawyer and social entrepreneur, which I like that description very much. Can we remove the curtains on this expression that I've just used twice, of this movement that you're both leaders of, A Land for All? And I don't know which of you wants to run at this first, but it is something that, at least in circles that I move in, is being more talked about. Omar, you have a new piece co-authored in Foreign Affairs. Tell us, what is A Land for All? What are the key things that we should be paying attention to?
Thank you, Daniel. It's wonderful to be here at IPI, and thank you for having us. Well, A Land for All is an Israeli-Palestinian joint movement of, at this point, thousands of Israelis and Palestinians that for the past 10 years have been co-creating an updated version, an updated vision of the two-state solution. We go by what we call two states, one homeland, meaning that, yes, there needs to be a two-state solution. There must be a solution to this conflict. There must be an end to this war. And in order to get there, we need a viable, practical, pragmatic, and maybe most importantly, joint vision. And what we're trying to do is, for hundreds of hours and with hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians from all around the homeland, including diaspora communities of Israelis and Palestinians, to articulate what are the needs of the two people, what are the values that we want on the table, what are the facts on the ground. As we know, the two-state solution is 30 years old right now, and therefore demands us to come up with some new ideas. And the paradigm that we're trying to push through this idea, which Omar will elaborate a little more in a moment, is really moving away from the paradigm that has led us in how we think about Israel-Palestine, which is through segregation and separation, and moving towards an agreement that is based more on integration, cooperation, shared interest, and a shared future, in order to ensure both individual and collective equality, and ensure a sustainable future for both Israelis and Palestinians in the homeland through a two-state solution, but with another mechanism ensuring our shared values and interests.
So I might elaborate just a little further on that. As Mai pointed out, what we are advocating is a two-state solution. And what it has in common with past visions is that we advocate a Palestinian state being established alongside the state of Israel, with a border between them based on the June 4th, 1967 line. In that sense, our approach is very familiar. Two states, two constitutional orders, a border between them, flags, participation in international organizations, etc. But what is different about our vision is two main things. The first is that A Land for All starts from the understanding that when we talk about Israel-Palestine, we're talking about one place. And that is a place, the length and breadth of which is cherished by both Israelis and by Palestinians. And accordingly, what is central to our approach and different from the longstanding two-state solution is the idea that over time, but definitely we would move toward a regime of freedom of movement and ultimately freedom of residence for all Israelis and Palestinians across our common homeland. And that move is important because it not only reflects our commitment to see that space the way so many Israelis and Palestinians do, to honor those attachments, but also because it helps to solve some of the things that have been barriers to a peace agreement in the past. It provides a solution to the settlements, whereas in the past, the only two options were seen to be either they're evacuated or they're annexed. And what we anticipate is instead that Israeli settlers would be able to remain in their homes if they chose to and become permanent residents of a state of Palestine, voting in Israeli elections for the Knesset, but local elections in their integrated communities. This helps to solve the issue of refugees because similarly, Palestinian refugees who have long demanded the right of return to their places of origin inside Israel would have the opportunity not only to become citizens of the state of Palestine, but also permanent residents of the state of Israel. And it provides a means of addressing the fact that the capital we both claim, Jerusalem, is not a place that can easily or conscionably be divided with a border between it, running through it. And so our regime of freedom of movement and residence provides an integrative solution for Jerusalem. On top of all of that, it reduces the stakes of determining where the border between Israel and Palestine will be, because it's understood that Israelis and Palestinians will have access to the whole homeland. The last thing I'll say, that the second main distinction between our approach and the separation-based model that dominated peacemaking for the last 30 years is that it anticipates an institutional framework built upon equality, equal sovereign rights between these two states, and interdependence, an understanding that in a space that is so small, that is just barely bigger than the state of Vermont, we can't pretend that total separation is possible. Our interests are thoroughly intertwined. And so with regard to matters ranging from external security to environmental protection, to the management of natural resources like water, to transportation, the list goes on, it'll be necessary for us to have joint institutions. And that includes joint judicial institutions as a complement to national courts.
So I have lots of questions about that, but I want to park those for one moment. I have leaned into a lot the idea that wherever we want to go in terms of a future of equality, the path to get there most quintessentially runs through a different incentive structure than that which exists today. That there needs to be accountability, the impunity has to end, Israel will have to pay a cost, sanctions, etc., and then maybe a space will open up. Let me park that. That's my thought. How do you see the positing of this vision, which we'll go into shortly? How does that impact the here and now, if at all? And maybe it's not for the here and now, but is there a way that you think about that issue of does this kind of an initiative have a role to play in getting us to that future?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's very important for all of us today specifically. I would say two things. Number one, political vision and a map, a roadmap that leads us to where we want to go is crucial for political change. And so everything you said, Daniel, is really crucial. But as an Israeli living in Israel and trying to change the reality from within, which is something that we're committed to as an Israeli and Palestinian organization, without hope, and there is no hope today in Israel-Palestine. There is no horizon, there is no future picture, and there hasn't been one for a very, very long time. And we have all been complicit in this acceptance of the fact that this conflict cannot be solved, should not be solved, and that we can just stay in this status quo, which of course has exploded in our faces and led us to this catastrophe that we are in now. And this catastrophe is in Gaza, and this catastrophe is in the West Bank, and this catastrophe is inside of Israel with a shrinking democracy, and this catastrophe is in Lebanon. And in a moment, it will become a regional war and crisis. So for us, it is crucial to connect the here and now to a political vision, to the horizon, and to something that will guide us in where we want to go and help every step in the way lead us there. Because every step that we take right now in Israel-Palestine will lead us to a future. Hopefully a future, right? I mean, the future can be more of the catastrophe because this is not rock bottom, unfortunately, or it can lead us to a viable one. And therefore, it's crucial that we present a viable vision, and it cannot be the one that has been a lip serve to maintaining things and thinking that they can last like that forever, whether it's apartheid or annexation or occupation. And so for us, it's what we are really doing is presenting that alternative political vision that can both create hope and social change in Israel and Palestine, but can also become really engineer the way towards a different future for Israel-Palestine and end to the conflict.
I want to just add one thing, if I could, to the point that you made, Mai, and maybe it's more in the nature of illustration than a different point. To our mind, a vision for the future is necessary to give direction, momentum, and legitimacy to the steps that are taken in the immediate term. If you look at a question like what should be done in the Gaza Strip in the so-called day after the war ends. Now, of course, one of the looming questions is whether there's going to be a day after or whether this will continue indefinitely in some form. And that's an important question. But when we think about what should happen in the Gaza Strip, we've got to think about stabilization, security on the ground. Having a vision for the future enables international actors to step in and know that they're not going to be in the crosshairs of the parties, because they will be able to say, we're not simply stepping in to be the new occupier. Mm-hmm. We are stepping in with a view toward moving down a path that ends in this legitimate destination. Secondly, recognizing from past experience, 5 wars, after each of which the international community pledged to rebuild Gaza, after none of which did Gaza actually get rebuilt, we know that it's not just a matter of money. It's also a matter of reconnecting the Gaza Strip to the West Bank. That can't be done unless there is an idea of what role Palestinian government will play in this process and will play and how we link that Palestinian government to a future vision. If we've left that vision undefined, then we're left in a predicament where we don't know which Palestinian actors to engage. And once again, I think the international community is left in a predicament of not knowing whom to support. And coming back to the point made, I'm just mentioning 2 steps along the way, but at each and every one of these steps, there's a set of decisions that has to be taken. And we can either take steps that move us toward a future that we can embrace, or as we experienced during the Oslo process, which the 3 of us are deeply and unhappily familiar with, we can flail around without a sense of that ultimate direction, assuming the worst of our partners, and end up with very, very prejudicial arrangements on the ground.
I'm hearing the vision that links the West Bank to Gaza, and I'm thinking the Palestinian population of Gaza has been displaced again. The first displacement wasn't from within Gaza and wasn't from the West Bank. And the language of linking the West Bank to Gaza is part of that language of Oslo with which we're all depressingly familiar. And help me unpack the alarm bells that go off in my head with that Oslo knowledge. Over time, move towards freedom of movement and residence. Over time is a scary idea, yes. I would argue. The settlers' day, is that conditional? And even the creation of any parallelism here, I find hard to articulate, to be honest. But is that conditioned on refugees returning? Let's start with those.
I hear you. The words "over time" make me think of the infamous phrase "no deadlines are sacred," uttered during the Oslo process.
That's the one I was looking for in my head.
In fact, it's the only. I think it's the only thing in the Oslo agreements that was scrupulously adhered to. Is the idea that no deadlines are sacred. I'll give you, to be honest, an unsatisfying answer. The answer, I think, starts by saying there are 2 points. Number one, that what distinguishes Oslo from this is that we are articulating an endpoint. And that, to me, is really important. And we can't forget that it was 1999 before major sponsors of the peace process, like the United States and Israel, uttered the word Palestinian state, and 2000 before the Israeli team did. And that contributed to the ability of opponents of the process that had been undertaken in Israel and among Palestinians to say, this is not something that we should undertake. So we do think that defining the endpoint really matters. It is an innovation. It is a difference. And an endpoint like this, one that is responsive to all of the parties' concerns, their deepest, or at least the legitimate aspirations and rights of the parties, also makes a difference. But the second thing I'll say is that there's no getting around the fact that these things take time. And it is a deep problem, the asymmetry that exists in Israel-Palestine, regardless of what path we take, whether it is toward a one-state solution, whether it is toward total separation, or whatever iteration that we might imagine. Implementation can't happen overnight. And that is true when we talk about reform in any system. And so what we have to work on is trying to find incentives that keep the parties on the path forward. Now, at times, those incentives have been upended. For example, when states decided to jump into diplomatic relations with Israel without a political horizon before them. And there was a set of reasons animating those, but they removed one potential incentive. I think one of the things that we will have to work through is how the international community, in a range of different ways, can incent forward progress. That's not an easy thing to figure out, but it's not unique to the confederal approach.
I want to add just something very pragmatic, actually. We are, how do I phrase this? We're trying to be pragmatic. I think that both Omar and I personally have all kinds of questions about nation states and what's the future of that, with climate change coming our way. And but we have to start with where reality right now is. And right now, most Israelis and Palestinians are still interested in the right for self-determination and their own independent sovereign state. And that's a very, very important point to take into consideration. And it's something that guides us in this productive tension that A Land for All, I think, represents, which is a commitment to the reality on the ground and to the people of Israel and Palestine, a commitment to the values that I think have been forgotten in many peace processes, and a real commitment to finding the way for a sustainable, viable future. And kind of holding that trinity pushes us sometimes, to not have perfect answers to everything, but try to think outside of the box and beyond the zero-sum game that we have been stuck in for so long, and to put something new that we really think can work and that holds what we need, in the center of it.
Let's grapple with that a bit more. As you said, Omar, we just earlier this year passed the quarter century mark of the expiration of Oslo, right? May 1999. That was the deadline. We both know that well. And the need to posit an endpoint, I think, is hard to argue with. You both mentioned, I think, how problematic separation and partition have been. And I would argue those have been drivers of the move to displacement and dispossession. It sounds like a lot of the logic and values walks us to one state and then pulls the rug from under our feet at the last minute. And I'm particularly trying to grapple with how one has equality without dismantling the structures of inequality, which are, to my mind, inherent in an ethno-national state, a Jewish state. And, the finding Palestinians reached a long time ago, Israeli human rights NGOs, the blue chip international NGOs, now the International Court of Justice. Can you have equality without dismantling apartheid? And does this achieve that? Because I get zero-sum outcomes. I get the settler colonial outcome where the native population, can build casinos in the reservations of the small areas in the small population that remains if we're thinking America. I understand the removal of the settler colonial population from the space, Algeria. I understand South Africa. I'm trying to understand how this takes us to a place that gets past what has brought us here in the first place.
I think in order to answer that, we have to think both about the vision that we're pursuing and about the alternative. So vis-a-vis the vision that we are pursuing, one way to think about it is as a way station, to understand that in any deeply divided place, the process of reconciliation is a century-long affair. When Ehud Barak, in the time when we were, opposite the table from each other, Daniel, used to talk about agreeing on end of conflict. That was a fiction. The idea that you end conflict overnight is completely at odds with the reality in pretty much any conflict area that you can think of. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a range of different processes to work, to operate. And so what we're trying to do is to create a framework that makes ending the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis more likely, more feasible. And part of our assumption is that Israeli Jews, who, let's be honest, hold more power in every respect than Palestinians in this framework, in a way that Israeli Jews can do while feeling a measure of comfort. And we are mindful of the fact that part of the reason Zionism emerged in the first place was because of skepticism about whether the liberal state could actually protect Jews from a hostile majority when things got tough. That was what got everyone concerned during the Dreyfus affair. And decades later, Herzl's apprehensions, from the point of view of many, ended up being vindicated by the Holocaust. Now, whether that view of history is the only acceptable one is not the point that I'm trying to address, but I think it is the view of history that many Israelis embrace. And I think that for many Israelis, they are prepared to take a range of different steps. I don't think that what they're prepared to do at this juncture is to accept the loss of Jewish sovereignty as a response to the Jewish problem, or as it has had historically been referred to. And so what we're trying to do here is to create a space within which we can try out a way more equitable framework for governance, for sharing power, for partnership. And if over time Palestinians and Israelis decide to move toward both greater integration and more perfect justice, then there's nothing that will keep us from doing it. But I think that the question that we have to ask folks who advocate for a one-state approach, as appealing as it sounds in some respects, is how you convince Israelis to dispense with the memory that has brought them to this moment, and asking Palestinians whether they are willing also to surrender self-determination for the coming century.
Before you jump in, Mike, can I focus a question a bit more and very briefly respond so that maybe we can go back to you as well, Omar, which is two things. One, you mentioned in those negotiations the end of conflict, which of course it wouldn't have been. The phrase that sticks in my mind and now in my throat more than that was the insistence on end of claims, where of course what was being negotiated was anything but. It is the model, where I'm going with this is the one thing that was inadmissible and has always been inadmissible, I think, in two-state talks. There's been a truth and reconciliation process. Is that something that this has sought to address? And then the other question is, there's another lived history, though, not only the failure of the liberal state when it came to Jews in the last century, but there's now the lived reality of the failure of the apartheid ethno-state. Also to provide security for Jews, and certainly what that has meant for Palestinians. You said that there are a range of different steps that Israelis would take, but one state isn't one of them. And that's why we'll come back, but I also turn to you, Maya, and ask maybe the exact opposite of the direction I've been going in so far. And this applies to Palestinians as well, of course. Is this not a time where, if anyone will agree to anything, it will be greater separation, given the enhanced sense of the threat posed by other? Right now, from the outside at least, it looks like Israelis, it's not a range of steps Israelis might take. There are no steps Israelis are politically even in the orbiting of the orbit of being willing to take that would be helpful to Palestinians. You know, a dramatic vote in other circumstances, in the circumstances of where we are, it went largely unnoticed in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, quite recently. Netanyahu puts forward a totally gratuitous bill saying no Palestinian state. Not a single Zionist member of Knesset, not from the center, not from the left, if one can call it that. I've tried to push from one side. Now you're insufficiently ambitious. Now let's come from the angle of, are you over ambitious?
A lot of people have been asking us about the polls from Israeli society. And what I try to always say is that the psyche of Israelis today cannot guide us in thinking about our future. If we settle for the current psyche of Israelis who, and I say this, you know, subjectively, Israelis right now, in our narrative, we are persecuted and our life and our future is in danger. And we see ourselves as still the victims.
The
we are also victims, but we are the ultimate victim. And it's all about that victimhood narrative. And so I think that asking, there's no doubt that we need this vision to be represented by the Israeli public. But there are two layers to this. One is we haven't presented, the progressive camp in Israel hasn't presented an alternative vision in a very, very long time. There is, we have been fixated that we don't have to even solve this conflict. We have been really, really convinced that we can manage and shrink it and not solve it ever, and that it doesn't affect us. Well, guess what? It does. And the vision that we have holding Israel now, like we're all kidnapped in this vision of a messianic, military-only future. And we have not done a good enough job in presenting an alternative. And I think that is crucial, again, for creating the political change that we want in order to get there. That's not enough, but it's a crucial component. And the other is, again, I don't think that the psyche of Israelis now and people in war and in trauma is the place that the ceiling of what we should aspire to. That's very, very dangerous. And so if you ask me practically, does the Israeli society now support a sovereign Palestinian state and in partnership and open borders? No. But do Israelis finally start to understand that this conflict is not sustainable, needs to be solved, and that our safety is conditioned by a regional security pact, that we are part of this region, and that every mechanism of segregation and separation, of $1 billion wall, of 16 years of siege, of hunger, of occupation, has that led us to security? The answer is no. And so we are pushing now in Israel to create a new understanding that only peace and only very tight cooperation, which you and me know is what has allowed for Israelis to feel safe in the past 20 years. It has been cooperation with the PA. It has been Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews living much more together, not perfectly, but much more together and safely, rather than Palestinians from Gaza and Israeli Jews. If you think about any viable future, it's clear that it has to be based on a form of cooperation and integration. It's just clear. And so that is a new narrative that we have to start building. We have to, because otherwise all the alternative lead us to, again, like an even deeper crisis.
I would argue that extreme oppression gave the illusion of safety rather than anything to do with cooperation. I think security cooperation has been a disaster for Palestinians, but
Sorry, I just wanted to say one thing. Again, just elaborating on one point that May made. Our colleague Dalia Shendlin, who is one of Israel's leading pollsters, along with Khalid Shikaki, Palestine's leading pollster, just released their latest numbers this last week. And there's a range of things that are really interesting in that. But there's one point that I think is really significant. As you signaled, as you also indicated, May, support for a two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians has fallen, particularly among Israelis. Among Palestinians, actually, it's risen just a little bit since October 7th in comparison with the year before. Support for confederation has remained somewhat steady and ranges from 30 to 40%, which is interesting. But the thing that is really significant is that for Israeli Jews, when a two-state solution of some kind was paired with a regional security framework, support for it climbed above 50% again. And that seems incredibly striking, particularly following the summer that we had. For years, Israelis have been saying Israel must be able to defend itself by itself. That was the mantra. And the whole framework was based upon independent capacity. This last summer, I think indicated that Israel simply cannot rely only on itself, that it needed its friends, including Arab allies over these last months. And I think that that has entered Israelis' psyches, and perhaps it can also be a way of creating incentive for moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Zaid, I want to thank Omar and Mai, and you brought Omar and Mai to IPI, and I want you to help unpack further why people should pay attention to this idea.
Well, as we've just heard, the message itself, I think, is powerful. It's powerful because it satisfies some of the fundamental points of contention, and yet leaves open also a collaboration in the future to fill in the gaps that exist and will need, as both Mai and Omar said, time and the application of a considerable amount of experienced knowledge into finalizing it. But also what is important is that the messengers, I mean, both Mai and Omar can articulate this in a way that can create some form of emotional capture. The architects of A Land for All have promoted their view, and most recently, Omar has co-authored a piece in foreign policy, which is an excellent piece in the foreign affairs. Sorry, Daniel Kurtzfilm would be furious with me. Foreign affairs, an excellent piece. But I would submit that presenting it on paper is not enough. Having humans convey it with the I dare say the sort of the charm and the empathy and the intelligence of two of its promoters, I think could have a considerable effect. And we have a large number of European and Arab foreign ministers attending a dinner at the International Peace Institute. You've attended in the past, and I thought there could be no better forum for them to hear the views of Mai and Omar in a sort of collective setting, strictly off the record. Hopefully they will not just stick to form, as we would often sort of spout the same things we would hear in a public forum. And I think we felt this is could be an important occasion to encourage further support for the ideas entailed in A Land for All. And so that's the reason that we have invited Mai and Omar here.
Thank you. And while that dinner may be off the record, this conversation very much wasn't. So it gave everyone else a chance to hear about this. Thank you all so much.